India, the next superpower or the next bubble? By January of 2026, India is projected to be the world's third largest economy, behind only the United States and China. It is growing at 7.7% annually, and it has 1.4 billion inhabitants. And it has the largest working age population on the planet. Near Bangalore, an iPhone factory hired 30,000 workers in under a year. 80% are young women who, for the first time in their lives, have a formal job with a contract. The whole world is betting on India as the next great engine of global growth. But there are cracks, extreme inequality, linguistic fragmentation, a labor market that is not generating enough formal jobs for its demographic explosion. Is India really the next economic superpower? Or are we watching the beginning of the next great disappointment of the 21st century? In this episode, we analyze the data without blind enthusiasm and without excessive pessimism. Every so often, the global economy finds a new country to call the next giant. During the 2000s, it was Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the famous BRIC acronym invented by a Goldman Sachs economist. During the following decade, it was the so-called frontier countries. Today, in 2026, that title falls almost unanimously on a single country, India. Is the enthusiasm justified? Largely yes. But as with any story of accelerated growth, it's worth looking beyond the headlines and examining the data rigorously, including the internal contradictions the Indian model has yet to resolve. Let's start with what's working, because it's genuinely impressive. According to revised estimates published in early 2026, India's real gross domestic product grew 7.7% during fiscal year 2026, matching the highest expansion rate since fiscal year 2022, which marked the post-pandemic recovery. This figure significantly exceeded the Indian government's own initial projection, which expected growth of between 6.3 and 6.8%. What drove that acceleration? Private consumer spending grew 7.7%, up from 5.8% the previous fiscal year. Gross fixed capital formation, meaning business investment in factories, infrastructure, and equipment, recovered strongly, reaching 7.1%, and public spending remained elevated, partially offsetting the impact of higher tariffs imposed by the United States and the forced reduction of cheap Russian oil imports due to international diplomatic pressure. The International Monetary Fund maintains a long-term growth outlook for India between 6 and 7%, far above any other major economy in the world right now. That sustained growth is driven by two key structural factors: the demographic dividend, a young, working-aged population that keeps growing year after year while China's and Europe's age, and a series of administrative reforms that have significantly improved government effectiveness, registering a 19.1 improvement over the last decade according to international indicators of institutional and regulatory quality. India also has external solvency backed by solid international reserves and maintains investment-grade ratings from major international credit agencies, which considerably facilitates access to financing on favorable terms in global capital markets. To understand what's really happening in India beyond abstract macroeconomic figures, there's one concrete case that illustrates it better than any report: Foxconn's new iPhone assembly plant near the city of Bangalore. In just 9 months, this plant hired nearly 30,000 workers, making it, according to an Economic Times report, the fastest hiring pace ever recorded at any factory in Indian industrial history. And the composition of that workforce is revealing. Approximately 80% of employees are women, mostly between 19 and 24 years old, entering formal employment for the first time in their lives. Foxconn projects the plant will employ up to 50,000 people once it reaches full capacity next year. China still concentrates more than 75% of all global iPhone production, while India currently represents around 18%, according to estimates from research firm Counterpoint. But that proportion is changing rapidly. According to sources cited by Reuters, Apple is taking urgent steps to move production of most iPhones sold in the United States to factories in India before the end of 2026, partly to dodge American tariffs on products manufactured in China. In March of 2026, Apple shipped around 600 tons of iPhones, worth $2 billion, from India to the United States in a single month, a historic record for both Foxconn and Tata, the Indian conglomerate that became a key Apple supplier in record time. The impact doesn't stop at direct employment. Research firm Rest of World documented how Foxconn's arrival completely transformed the local economy in Devanahalli, the area where the plant is located. Before the factory's construction, food delivery platforms like Zomato didn't even operate in the area because of the town's poor roads. Today, Zomato and Swiggy delivery workers are a constant presence. Amazon will move its Bangalore office to the area by the end of April 2026, and real estate prices have skyrocketed. A property that cost around 3,500 rupees per square foot in 2019 now sells for several times that value, explicitly advertised by sellers with the phrase near Foxconn as a selling point. This is exactly the kind of economic transformation that supports the optimistic case for India. Massive formal employment, direct foreign investment from global technology giants, and multiplier effects that extend far beyond the factory itself into an entire regional economy. Now let's get to the part the most optimistic headlines tend to omit, and that deserves the same rigor. Despite the economic dynamism, India's real gross domestic product per capita remains relatively low compared to other economies of similar size. Growing at 7% annually sounds impressive in aggregate terms, but when divided among 1.4 billion people, the impact on individual living standards is much more gradual than the headline suggests. Indian society remains deeply unequal. The national literacy rate is 76%, meaning roughly 1 in 4 adults cannot read or write fluently enough to fully participate in a modern economy. And the country is enormously fragmented culturally. The probability that two randomly selected people in India speak the same language as their first tongue is barely 36%. That linguistic and cultural fragmentation enormously complicates international market integration, labor mobility between states, and the uniform implementation of public policies at a national scale, something China, with a predominant language and a much more centralized administrative system, never had to face in the same way. The labor market presents another serious structural fragility. Agriculture, forestry, and fishing represent barely 12% of the country's total economic output, but employ more than half of India's entire labor force. That means more than half of the country's workers generate a very small portion of total economic value, a deep imbalance reflecting structural low agricultural productivity and a scarce transition of workers towards better paying manufacturing or service sectors like the one that is happening, for now only in isolated cases, in places like Devanahalli. India also faces persistent structural deficits in its current account and national fiscal accounts. Although low external debt relative to its income and adequate international reserves act as a reasonable protective cushion, these deficits represent a real vulnerability that any severe external shock, a sharp and sustained spike in oil prices, a global financial crisis comparable in magnitude to 2008, could quickly worsen without much room to maneuver. There's one data point that deserves special attention because it partly contradicts the most optimistic and enthusiastic narrative about India. The Economic Freedom Index survey, prepared annually by the Heritage Foundation, places India at rank 128 out of 184 economies evaluated globally, with a score of 53 out of 100, barely a marginal improvement of 0.1 points from the previous year, despite a full decade of reforms announced with great political fanfare. That ranking is far below what any analyst would expect from the economy officially projected to become the world's third largest. The explanation lies in persistent regulatory barriers, in bureaucracy that remains notoriously slow and opaque in many Indian states, and in international trade restrictions that continue complicating doing business in the country despite reforms implemented over the past decade under Narendra Modi's government. This doesn't invalidate the optimistic case for India. The Foxconn example demonstrates that when conditions align correctly, India can attract investment and generate formal employment at an exceptional pace. But it does suggest that the path towards becoming a full, consolidated economic superpower is not as linear or guaranteed as some particularly enthusiastic headlines suggest. The structural reforms still needed, deep regulatory simplification, widespread educational improvement, massive formalization of the labor market, are processes that typically take entire decades, not just a few years of favorable growth. This episode's title question deserves an honest, nuanced answer, not an easy headline or a binary conclusion. India is not a bubble in the traditional financial sense of the term. There is no single overvalued asset about to suddenly collapse overnight. Economic growth is real, backed by genuine and verifiable investment, as the Foxconn case demonstrates, and sustained by solid demographic fundamentals that no other major country in the world currently possesses at this specific magnitude. But there is what we could precisely call a narrative bubble, the fairly widespread tendency among analysts, international investors, and media outlets to project onto India a future of practically guaranteed success, ignoring or minimizing the real structural obstacles the country still must effectively overcome. Persistent extreme inequality, deep linguistic and cultural fragmentation, chronic low agricultural productivity, fiscal deficits that persist year after year, and a regulatory environment that, according to independent and rigorous measurements, remains considerably more restrictive than official discourse suggests. Global economic history is full of countries that at some point seemed unmistakably destined for greatness, and that ended up tripping over their own internal contradictions long before reaching their promised destination. India undoubtedly has all the objective conditions necessary to become a genuine, lasting economic superpower, but having the necessary conditions has never itself guaranteed the final outcome. It requires sustained execution over entire decades, something very few countries in all of modern economic history have managed to maintain without significantly deviating from the original path. India is growing at 7.7% annually. It has the youngest and most numerous population on the planet. It has a privileged geopolitical position that allows it to negotiate simultaneously with all major powers without depending entirely on any single one. And it has concrete, verifiable cases like Foxconn and Devanahali demonstrating the model can work at an impressive scale when the pieces align correctly. These are extraordinary assets no serious analyst can afford to ignore. But India also carries deep and persistent inequalities, structural internal fragmentation, and a bureaucracy that continues to measurably hold back its real potential. India's future is still not definitively written, and the difference between becoming the next global economic power or remaining stuck at the threshold for decades will ultimately depend on concrete political decisions being made or, unfortunately, postponed right now, in this exact year, 2026. The enthusiasm is justified by the data, so is the caution in equal measure.